You've done this before, right? You're at someone's house. Your phone's about to die, and you ask the most vulnerable question of the 21st century. Hey, do you have a charger? And then comes the follow-up. The one that decides everything. iPhone or Android? Because for over a decade, those were two completely different worlds. Two cables. Two ecosystems. Two drawers full of tangled wires that absolutely could not help each other. You'd rummage through a junk drawer, pull out a cable, and it was always the wrong one. Always. But then, in September 2023, something happened. Apple released the iPhone 15, and for the first time in 11 years, there was no Lightning port on the bottom. Instead, sitting right there was USB-C. The same port on your Android phone, the same port on your laptop, the same port on your Nintendo Switch, your headphones, your friend's tablet, and honestly, probably your toothbrush at this point. And the internet collectively went, finally. But here's what most people missed. Apple didn't just wake up one morning feeling generous about universal charging. This wasn't some sudden realization that one cable for everything would be nice. This story goes way deeper than a port swap, and it starts with a question that sounds simple but really isn't. Why did Apple create Lightning in the first place? Rewind to 2012. Smartphones were getting thinner, faster, more capable every year, and Apple had a problem. The original iPhone connector, that wide, chunky 30-pin dock connector, had been around since 2003. It was massive. It hogged valuable internal space. And you had to fumble around to plug it in the right way, usually in the dark, usually at 2 in the morning, usually failing twice before getting it right. So Apple designed something new, Lightning. And honestly, it was impressive. Tiny, reversible, you could plug it in either way without looking. In 2012, that genuinely felt like magic. USB at the time still had that infuriating try, flip, try again ritual that made you question your spatial awareness as a human being. Lightning skipped all of that. But here's the detail that quietly shaped the next decade. Lightning wasn't just a technical upgrade, it was a business decision. Apple owned it completely. Every company that wanted to make a Lightning cable or accessory had to get Apple's blessing, join something called the MFI program, pay licensing fees, and use Apple-approved chips inside the connector itself. Every single cable, every single dock, every single car adapter. That tiny port became a tiny toll booth, and the revenue? Enormous. Not just from Apple's own cables, which, let's be honest, frayed if you even looked at them wrong, but from the entire ecosystem of third-party accessories, paying Apple for the privilege of connecting to your phone. So Lightning wasn't just a connector, it was a walled garden, disguised as convenience. Meanwhile, the rest of the tech world was moving in a completely different direction. USB-C showed up around 2014, and it was basically everything Lightning promised to be. Reversible, compact, elegant, but with one critical difference. It was open, universal, anyone could use it. No licensing fees, no proprietary chips, no permission needed. One cable for everything. Android phones adopted it, laptops adopted it, tablets, gaming devices, cameras, even Apple's own MacBooks and iPads started using USB-C, which created this absurd situation where you could charge your MacBook and your iPad with the exact same cable. But your iPhone? Nope, different cable, different universe, same company. Customers noticed, and year after year, every iPhone launch became a ritual of the same question. Did they switch to USB-C yet? And year after year, the answer was no. Apple held on to Lightning like a family heirloom, and the justification got thinner every single time. But something was brewing across the Atlantic that Apple couldn't charm its way out of. The European Union had been watching the cable chaos for years. Not just Apple's, everyone's. Remember the early 2000s? Every single phone had a different charger. Nokia had one shape, Motorola had another. Samsung had something else entirely. Your drawer wasn't a drawer, it was a cable graveyard. Billions of chargers manufactured, used briefly, then tossed into landfill. Mountains of electronic waste piling up because companies couldn't agree on a plug. So the EU started pushing, first gently with voluntary agreements. Hey, could you all maybe just pick one standard? And to be fair, most manufacturers eventually did. They slowly converged on micro USB and later USB-C. The industry was consolidating naturally, except one company, Apple, kept Lightning, and the EU kept pushing. Gentle suggestions became firm recommendations. Firm recommendations became proposals, and proposals became law. In 2022, the European Parliament passed a directive that said, essentially, by the end of 2024, all phones, tablets, cameras, headphones, portable speakers, handheld consoles, e-readers, readers, keyboards, mice, earbuds, and navigation devices sold in the EU must use USB-C for wired charging. Not a suggestion, not a guideline, a law, and this is the part that changed everything. Apple sells roughly a quarter of its iPhones in Europe. You don't just walk away from a quarter of your market, and you definitely don't manufacture a special European iPhone with USB-C while keeping Lightning everywhere else. That's logistically absurd and financially pointless. So when Europe said USB-C, it effectively said USB-C for the entire planet. Now, Apple will never publicly say they were forced. That's not how Apple communicates. At the iPhone 15 announcement, they emphasized how USB-C gives customers faster data transfer, how it simplifies the experience, how it's better for everyone. All true, all real benefit. But conspicuously absent from that presentation, any mention of the EU regulation that made the whole thing inevitable. Because admitting you were compelled doesn't exactly fit the "we innovate because we choose to" brand identity. But to really understand the gravity of this shift, we have to look at what Apple actually lost. Because this wasn't just about changing a hole in the bottom of a phone. It was about the collapse of a financial empire. For over a decade, Apple operated a system called MFI, which stands for Made for iPhone. On the surface, it sounded like a quality control measure. Apple told the world, we just want to make sure your third-party cables don't fry your battery. And sure, there's some truth to that, but in reality, MFI was a licensing machine. Imagine every single company that wanted to make a Lightning cable, whether it was a giant like Belkin or a random brand on Amazon, having to pay a tax to Apple. They had to buy specific chips from Apple to put inside the connector, and they had to pay a licensing fee for the privilege. It was a genius move. Apple didn't just make money selling the expensive cables in their own stores. They made money every time anyone else sold a cable. It was a passive income stream on a global scale. Analysts estimate that the MFI program brought in billions of dollars over the years. When Apple switched to USB-C, they didn't just switch a port, they demolished their own toll booth. The tax was gone. The highway became free for everyone. For a company that optimizes every single cent of its ecosystem, giving that up was a massive pill to swallow. But then there's the environmental side of the story, which is where the EU's argument becomes almost impossible to fight. Think about your own junk drawer for a second. We all have one. That tangle of white, black, and gray wires that don't fit anything you currently own. Now, multiply that by every single person on Earth. The EU estimated that discarded and unused chargers were creating about 11,000 metric tons of electronic waste every single year in Europe alone. That's not just a bit of trash. That's a mountain of plastic, copper, and rare earth metals piling up in landfills, because companies decided that proprietary was more important than universal. By forcing the switch to USB-C, the EU wasn't just fighting for the convenience of the user, they were fighting a war against waste. They realized that if you make one cable work for everything, your phone, your Kindle, your headphones, your vape, your power bank, you suddenly don't need 10 different cables. You need one. And when that one cable eventually breaks, you throw away one piece of plastic, not 10. Now let's be fair. Some people, mostly the hardcore tech enthusiasts, actually missed Lightning. And they had a technical reason for it. See, the Lightning connector was designed with the pins on the outside, on the cable itself. The port in the phone was just a hollow slot. This meant that if you wore down the connector or bent a pin, you just bought a new $5 cable. Your expensive phone remained untouched. USB-C flips that. The delicate pins are inside the phone. If a piece of conductive lint gets stuck in there, or if you accidentally jam something into the port, you're not replacing a cable. You're paying for a motherboard repair. It's a legitimate trade-off. We traded a bit of hardware durability for the sake of universal convenience. But if you think Apple is just going to sit back and let the world dictate their hardware forever, you don't know Apple. Because here's the real twist, the end game. If you look at the history of Apple products, there is a very clear pattern. They introduce a feature, they refine it, make it proprietary, and then they remove it entirely. First, it was the floppy disk drive. Then, it was the CD-ROM. Then, the most controversial move of all, the 3.5mm headphone jack. Apple didn't just remove the jack. They told us that courage was the reason they did it, and then they conveniently sold us AirPods to fill the gap. So, is USB-C the final destination? Probably not. The most likely future isn't a universal port, it's no port at all. Imagine an iPhone that is a single seamless slab of glass and titanium. No holes, no slots, no one to let dust and water in. You charge it wirelessly via MagSafe. You transfer data via ultra-fast Wi-Fi or a future version of Bluetooth. By removing the port entirely, Apple solves two problems at once. First, they stop being bullied by the EU because there is no charging port to regulate. Second, they create a device that is more waterproof and more durable than anything else on the market. And just like with the headphone jack, they'll probably frame it as a revolutionary leap forward in design. We've liberated you from the cable. But until that day comes, we are living in a weird, wonderful moment of tech harmony. For the first time in over a decade, the iPhone versus Android war ties a ceasefire in the junk drawer. You can walk into a room, ask for a charger, and actually get one that works. You don't have to check the brand, you just check the shape. It took a decade of consumer frustration, a mountain of electronic waste, and the legal might of the European Union to make it happen. It wasn't a gift from Apple, and it wasn't a sudden burst of generosity. It was the result of the world finally deciding that some things, like the simple act of charging your phone, should just be universal. So next time you plug your iPhone into a USB-C cable, take a second to appreciate it. Not because the technology is new, USB-C has been around for years, but because it represents a rare victory for the user over the ecosystem. The walled garden finally has a gate, and we can all walk through it. If you're still clinging to those old lightning cables, maybe it's time to let them go. Or keep them in that drawer as a museum piece. A reminder of the era when your charger was a loyalty test and borrowing a cable felt like a diplomatic negotiation. One cable, one standard, one less thing to worry about. It was about time. If you found this deep dive interesting, let me know in the comments. Do you actually prefer USB-C, or do you miss the simplicity of the Lightning port? And if there's another everyday thing you've always wondered about, drop the suggestion below. I'll see you in the next one.